My name is John Strope. Welcome to History Nebraska's Brown Bag History Lecture Series. Lectures are held monthly on the third Thursday in the Old Father Family Auditorium at the Nebraska History Museum in downtown Lincoln. Learn more about History Nebraska and our programs and services at history.nebraska.gov. If you are not a member of History Nebraska, I encourage you to join. Your support allows us to provide programs like the Brown Bag Lecture Series free for all Nebraskans. For a full list of membership benefits, visit our website. As we note each month, special thanks goes to the Nebraska State Historical Society Foundation for the financial support which allows us to tape and broadcast these programs across the state. We'd also like to thank LNK-TV, a service of the City of Lincoln, which produces these programs. This program is really, really special again for the Brown Bags and for the Foundation. For a second time this year, AARP Nebraska is paying the full expenses for producing this video. This is part of AARP Nebraska's support, passing on the stories of African Americans over 50 in the community who have made and are making history. And let me take my hat off as producing these brown bags to putting on my hat as a trustee of the Nebraska State Historical Society Foundation. I know how much it means to have this support from AARP, so thank you, folks. If you would like to watch previous Brown Bag lectures, visit the History Nebraska YouTube page at youtube.com/History Nebraska. See playlists. There are over 180 programs on there. Our topic today is Ho for Lincoln, the promises and perils of black mobility in the Great Plains. Our speaker is Dr. Jeannette Eileen Jones, NU Associate Professor of History and Ethnic Studies. Dr. Jones received her BA in History with minors in Political Science and Philosophy from Hofstra University. She earned her Master's of Arts and Doctor of Philosophy degrees in History from the University of Buffalo. Just to let you know about asking questions, Dr. Jones prefers you wait until the end. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jeannette Eileen Jones.
Thank you. Good afternoon. It's my pleasure to participate in the History Nebraska Brown Bag Series lecture. I would like to thank History Nebraska, John Strope, the AARP of Nebraska, the Nebraska State Historical Society Foundation, LNK-TV City, and the History Nebraska cable partners that I've listed on the previous slide. Today, my talk is entitled, as John said, Ho for Lincoln, the promises and perils of black mobility on the Great Plains. My goal today is to give not only a lecture, but also to have a conversation with you about black African American mobility after emancipation, and to place that mobility in a broader historical context that extends beyond Lincoln, Nebraska, and the Great Plains. What do I mean by that? I want us to consider the political, social, and economic forces at play in the United States during the late 19th century that would propel African Americans from the South to move westward, where there were little to no established black communities. And not only to come westward, but to bet on a future in unknown territory. To put it more bluntly, what kind of resilience, courage, and yes, fear did black folks possess during a time of tremendous national upheaval to move to Nebraska or any other place outside of the Jim Crow South? Their story starts in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, when enslaved African Americans finally received their freedom that they and their ancestors collectively had fought for centuries to obtain. The first record of enslaved Africans to land in what is present-day United States actually arrived in the 1500s. However, in 1619, 20 and odd, which we translate as 22, Africans landed at the port of Jamestown, Virginia. In this painting, you can see them, if I can point to them, actually I can. You can see them chained sitting on the ground. These were the first recorded Africans to be in what is present day the United States of America. That was part of the original 13 colonies. As I said, there were Africans in places like Florida and South Carolina, but it was under the Spanish before then. But this is when we date 1619, the arrival of Africans in America for the purposes of U.S. history. And this is the year that we celebrate that, 1919. By the time of the Revolutionary War, however, enslaved Africans and African Americans lived in every colony in British North America. While the northern states would abolish slavery in the first 2 decades of the early republic's existence, and the United States would abolish the slave trade effectively January 1st, 1808, slavery remained at the core of American politics and economy. The abolition of slavery in 1865 via the 13th Amendment did not end the travails of Black folks. In fact, the promises and perils of freedom were ever more clear. I will let Ta-Nehisi Coates explain.
Yesterday, when asked about reparations, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell offered a familiar reply. America should not be held liable for something that happened 150 years ago, since none of us currently alive are responsible. This rebuttal proffers a strange theory of governance, that American accounts are somehow bound by the lifetime of its generations. But well into this century, the United States was still paying out pensions to the heirs of Civil War soldiers. We honor treaties that date back some 200 years, despite no one being alive who signed those treaties. Many of us would love to be taxed for the things we are solely and individually responsible for. But we are American citizens, and thus bound to a collective enterprise that extends beyond our individual and personal reach. It would seem ridiculous to dispute invocations of the founders or the greatest generation on the basis of a lack of membership in either group. We recognize our lineage as a generational trust, as inheritance. And the real dilemma posed by reparations is just that, a dilemma of inheritance. It is impossible to imagine America without the inheritance of slavery. As historian Ed Baptist has written, enslavement, quote, shaped every crucial aspect of the economy and politics of America, so that by 1836, more than 600 million, or almost half of the economic activity in the United States derived directly or indirectly from the cotton produced by the million-odd slaves. By the time the enslaved were emancipated, they comprised the largest single asset in America, $3 billion in 1860 dollars, more than all the other assets in the country combined. The method of cultivating this asset was neither gentle cajoling nor persuasion, but torture, rape, and child trafficking. Enslavement reigned for 250 years on these shores. When it ended, this country could have extended its hallowed principles, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness to all regardless of color. But America had other principles in mind. And so for a century after the Civil War, Black people were subjected to a relentless campaign of terror, a campaign that extended well into the lifetime of Majority Leader McConnell. It is tempting to divorce this modern campaign of terror, of plunder, from enslavement. But the logic of enslavement, of white supremacy, respects no such borders. And the god of bondage was lustful and begat many heirs, coup d'etats and convict leasing, vagrancy laws and debt peonage, redlining and racist GI bills, poll taxes and state-sponsored terrorism. We grant that Mr. McConnell was not alive for Appomattox, but he was alive for the electrocution of George Stinney. He was alive for the blinding of Isaac Woodward. He was alive to witness kleptocracy in his native Alabama and a regime premised on electoral theft. Majority Leader McConnell cited civil rights legislation yesterday, as well he should, because he was alive to witness the harassment, jailing, and betrayal of those responsible for that legislation by a government sworn to protect them. He was alive for the redlining of Chicago and the looting of black homeowners of some $4 billion. Victims of that plunder are very much alive today. I am sure they'd love a word with the Majority Leader. What they know, what this committee must know, is that while emancipation deadbolted the door against the bandits of America, Jim Crow wedged the windows wide open. And that is the thing about Senator McConnell's something. It was 150 years ago, and it was right now. The typical black family in this country has 1/10 the wealth of the typical white family. Black women die in childbirth at 4 times the rate of white women. And there is, of course, the shame of this land of the free, boasting the largest prison population on the planet, of which the descendants of the enslaved make up the largest share. The matter of reparations is one of making amends and direct redress, but it is also a question of citizenship. In H.R. 40, this body has a chance to both make good on its 2009 apology for enslavement and reject fair-weather patriotism, to say that a nation is both its credits and its debits, that if Thomas Jefferson matters, so does Sally Hemings, that if D-Day matters, so does Black Wall Street, that if Valley Forge matters, so does Fort Pillow. Because the question really is not whether we will be tied to the somethings of our past, but whether we are courageous enough to be tied to the whole of them. Thank you.
So the question is, how does one go from being an asset to a citizen of the United States? Because that is what African Americans faced in 1865. Those who had been enslaved, those who had been free, were living in the United States, but they were not citizens. So how do you go from being stateless people or assets counted as commodities to citizens? What are the ways that African Americans responded? One was migration. That is why we are here in Nebraska. Black migration out of the South is frankly a direct result of the United States' refusal to repair or make real restitution for the oppression that the 13 colonies and the nation inflicted on enslaved and free blacks. This relentless campaign of terror, as Ta-Nehisi Coates terms it, pushed black people out of the South, allured by the promise of, quote, real, unquote, freedom on the western frontier. How so? Through land ownership and economic self-determination. Yet, peril, the risk of death, destruction, and loss were realities of black life in the West, including in Nebraska and its capital city. So what about Black Nebraska? As you know, in 1854, the U.S. Congress passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which organized the territories of Kansas and Nebraska, dispossessing Native American nations of large tracts of their traditional lands. The legislation affirmed, and I'm going to quote at some length, quote, that nothing in this act contained shall construed to impair the rights of person or property now pertaining the Indians in said territories, so long as such rights shall remain unextinguished by treaty between the United States and such Indians, or include any territory which, by treaty with any Indian tribe, is not, without the consent of said tribe, to be included within the territorial line or jurisdiction of any state or territory. But all such territory shall accept it out of the boundaries and constitute no part of the territory of Nebraska. In other words, what we know is coming. Reservations will be set up, and around that you will have what is known as Nebraska territory, as you see in the map, much bigger than the state, and then later on the state of Nebraska. Again, not constitute no part of the territory of Nebraska until said tribe shall signify their assent to the President of the United States to be included within the said territory of Nebraska, or to affect the authority of the government of the United States, make any regulations respecting such Indians, their lands, property, or other rights by treaty, law, or otherwise. That was 1854. In 1862, in the midst of the Civil War, the U.S. Congress passed the Homestead Act, which would allow people to claim land in the Western territories, 150 acres, 80 acres, depending on one's status. But during the 19th century, the government created in this what become the state of Nebraska, but at that point, the territory and the state, 8 Indian reservations through treaties with the Omaha, Pawnee, Oto, Santee Sioux, Winnebago, Ponca, Iowa, and the Sauk and Fox. Today, only 6 remain as part of the state. Of course, these treaties could never repair the genocide inflicted on the indigenous people. When Nebraska earned statehood on March 1st, 1867, slavery had only ended 2 years prior. You have to stop and think about that. Nebraska became a state in 1867. Slavery was abolished in 1865 through the 13th Amendment. Fittingly, yesterday, if y'all don't know, June 19th was Juneteenth, yes? The day that African Americans celebrate the moment when the state of Texas announced the abolition of slavery. Slavery had already been abolished, but Texas did not announce it. Only after federal troops arrived in Galveston. And so this is the day that we celebrate on June 19th, when those enslaved persons in Texas learned that they had been freed by the 13th Amendment. But we should also note that throughout the 19th century, even though we do celebrate Juneteenth, African Americans celebrate Emancipation Day on January the 1st, which is the day to commemorate the Emancipation Proclamation that freed some African Americans and went into effect on January 1st, 1863. And so you have 2 wonderful celebrations occurring in the 19th century, Juneteenth, which lasts today, and those people who go to church, or particularly black churches, January 1st, there's usually a lock-in on that the day before January 1st, so New Year's Eve, and then you celebrate with a speech on Emancipation Day, which is January 1st. 2 wonderful, as I said, celebrations that went well into the turn of the 20th century. So, to put Nebraska statehood in perspective, while settlers exercised their popular sovereignty to determine whether or not slavery would exist in the territory, this is before statehood was achieved in 1867, slavery remained a viable and strong institution in the United States. Remember Edward Baptist, who is quoted by Ta-Nehisi Coates. He states in his book, quote, by 1836, more than $600 million, almost half of the economic activity in the United States, derived directly or indirectly from the cotton produced by the million-odd slaves, unquote. That Nebraskans leaned towards being a free territory, and then hence a free state, while Kansas engaged in a civil war known as Bleeding Kansas, did not mean that Nebraskans welcomed black people into the territory or later the state with open arms. Post-Civil War black migration westward, notably and understandably, entailed movements to set up all black towns or colonies. This should not be lost on us. Overwhelmingly, white Americans had not proven that they were willing to live peacefully with African Americans or to recognize them as full citizens of the United States with equal rights and amenities. Logically then, Black folks opted to live in secluded towns, governed by blacks, funded by blacks, and inhabited by blacks. Spaces such as the famed Nicodemus, Kansas, or Nebraska's own DeWitty Colony. These black migrants responded to their marginalization and second-class citizenship status in the United States by opting to live apart from whites rather than as their subordinates in long-established cities, towns, and hamlets. This is a sobering fact often lost on Americans. That is, that white supremacy, anti-black racism, and terrorism were not abstractions, but everyday realities for black folks, and no African American wanted any parts of them. So let me share some pre- and post-Civil War population statistics with you, comparing Nebraska to other Great Plains territories and states, so we can get a sense of the growth of the black population, particularly in Nebraska. So the two dates I'm going to give you are from the 1860 census and the 1870 census. Dakota Territory, which is north of our territory, at that point Nebraska Territory, now the state. In 1860, it was unknown how many black people lived in the state. However, in the 1870 census, there were reported 94 African Americans. In Indian Territory, which is now the state of Oklahoma, in 1860, there was a recorded 8,376 African Americans living in the state, or the territory, including those who came as slaves with the so-called Five Nations. What we know is in 1870, that number decreased to 6,378. Some of them who had been set free, of course, when the war ended, so they were no longer enslaved by the Five Nations, and they moved outside of what is now Oklahoma. Still was Indian Territory in 1870. In Kansas, in 1860, the black population was 627 persons. This is important. In 1870, there were 17,108 black people living in Kansas. That's a lot. That's more than double. If I do the math, we know what it is, right? From 627 to 17,108, mainly as a result of what was called the Exoduster movement. Black people leaving the South, moving into Kansas, crossing over the Missouri River, going to places like Topeka, Leavenworth, Wichita, and of course, the all-black town Nicodemus. And there are plenty of books about that, and we can talk about that during the Q&A session. Then Nebraska. In 1860, the census reported 82 African Americans living in Nebraska in 1860. We know, however, that in 1854, there was a reported 15 or so living in Nebraska, most likely 13 or 15, depends on who's writing it. Most likely they were enslaved, because even though the people in the territory did not want slavery, there were people who were bringing their slaves into the territory nonetheless. So that's 1860. In 1870, we know that there are 789 black people living in the state of Nebraska, and not all of them in Lincoln and Omaha out west, yes, including DeWitty Colony, or what becomes DeWitty Colony. The largest black population is in Texas. This is a Great Plains state, at least the western part. In 1860, 182,921 blacks. And then in 1870, as a result of another migration from the South, 253,475. So what are these numbers telling us? Black people are on the move, mostly coming from the South to the Great Plains states, Dakotas, Indian Territory, which is Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska, and the western part of Texas. During Reconstruction, the years 1865 to 1877, African Americans arrived in Nebraska in small numbers, as we can see. Some as Buffalo Soldiers and others as homesteads. This is really homesteaders, the first group. We have those people who are Buffalo Soldiers and those who are homesteaders. So the Buffalo Soldiers, for those of you who are not familiar, what we count for the state of Nebraska were 25 men who served in 4 regiments. And these are regiments that were formed during the Civil War, including the 9th and 10th Cavalries and the 24th and 25th Infantry Regiments. And these were the first African-American Western historical figures to gain public attention, whether they were in Nebraska or other parts of the West. There were all kinds of articles about these Buffalo Soldiers. Some of them then went on to fight in the Spanish-American War. But a lot of them fought in what were known as the Indian Wars, including those on the plains. So what do we see? In the Civil War, right after the Civil War, there was a reduction in overall troops. This was decided by the government. So during the war, there was 1.5 million people in the Union ranks, so in Union troops, and then 16,000 immediately after war. Slowly, as we get to wars around 1877, that number has increased to about 54,000. And we see some of that increase has to do with a potential invasion of Mexico, intervention in Mexican affairs, but also, as I said, the so-called Indian Wars, warfare with Native Americans, indigenous peoples on the plains and points westward. And we also see the military important in westward expansion, going with groups of people who are in caravans, moving westward during this time. And Buffalo Soldiers count among them. Here is 2 photographs. These are actually courtesy of the Nebraska State one is, Nebraska State Historical Society, both of them you can see. One from Fort Niobrara, Nebraska, and one on the border from Wounded Knee in 1890, post-Wounded Knee. So they were the first people to be celebrated. And then you have, I'll tell you later, we'll talk about the homesteaders. Omaha and Lincoln would later become destinations for blacks who were searching for urban centers with viable wage labor. And so I think one of the things that I want to emphasize is that this is really a rural migration. Black people are coming from the rural South and they're moving to the rural West to own land, to be farmers, to have their own economic self-sufficiency. The second wave of migration westward to places like Nebraska and Kansas are more urban, right? People are coming to work in urban centers to get wage labor. But we always must remember that this is an agrarian at first, rural migration. So whatever their destinations, blacks had to face Reconstruction in the West and the limitations on black freedom. And we tend to think of Reconstruction only as a Southern thing, like the South is getting reconstructed. There's all kinds of acts to make sure that the Southern states are in compliance with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, that they're restored to normal conditions and relations with the federal government. But Reconstruction also unfolded in the West. So what did blacks have to face in these states and territories? A host of anti-black legislation. One, the denial of suffrage. Now, people knew after the 15th Amendment was ratified in 1870 that black men had the right to vote, not women. And they figured that if they could not vote in the South because of laws that were enacted, whether it's literacy tests, grandfather clauses, poll taxes, that if they moved out west, they would be able to vote. This was not the case. In a lot of sites in the West, we see black people being denied suffrage. Some of them are adopting poll taxes. I'll talk about the Nebraska law shortly. We also know that blacks were denied the right to serve in the militia. That is not to be confused with the military. The military is the United States. There were states that had militia in territories, and blacks were not allowed to serve in them out west. We also know that African Americans were excluded from public schools out west. Of course, we know that the landmark Supreme Court case, Brown versus the Board of Education, is of Topeka, Kansas, as the lead case, right? It is a school in the Plains that is Amanda Brown's school that she wanted to go to, and so they become the lead litigant in that case. So exclusion from public schools goes into the 20th century. We also know that even if blacks moved to some of the western states, they were excluded from jury duty. That means you could not serve on a jury. You were not considered a peer. Also, and there are several important cases that were tried in local district courts. African Americans were denied access to public transportation and accommodation. At this point, we're talking mostly about trains. And if in trains, they had to go in segregated cars, and also other conveyances, wagons, stagecoaches, and the like. And interestingly, there was a ban on interracial marriages. When I talk about DeWitty Colony, that's going to be interesting because the family that came here, they were actually married in in Canada before they came here. So their marriage could not be undone. But we'll talk about that. So those were the kinds of legislations that black people had to face in the West. As I said, in Nebraska, they did as well. Nebraska passed its own suffrage law that denied the right of suffrage to black men. It was written in the Constitution that the vote was for white men, right? So this is a peril. However, unlike Texas, and this is where Nebraska differs, Nebraska did not pass a whites-only homestead law. And this is our Homestead Act. So this is important. In 1862, as I told you, the Homestead Act was passed. And if you read the legislation, there is no racial designation about who could be a homesteader. And what we saw happening is states wanted, in the South, wanted to pass white-only acts. There was a Southern Homestead Act, and that was able to stand. Nebraska did no such thing. So if you wanted to move to Nebraska and be a homesteader, if you were black, you could be a homesteader. And that's what black people did. So that was a promise. Yet racial violence occurred in the West during Reconstruction and took several forms such as lynching and murder. Peril. So we talked about the Buffalo Soldiers. So blacks are living in places like DeWitty, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. And they're coming to Nebraska. Some of them are settling in Omaha and Lincoln, outside of Omaha in the agrarian areas. And Nebraska is a hotbed of political activity. Populism. A lot of people think of populism as being born outside of Nebraska, but it has its roots in the plains, right? Particularly in Illinois, Nebraska, we'll talk about the Omaha platform, and in Kansas. And what in some, and I'll play Omar Ali, professor at Townsend University, talk about black populism, but if you think about what's happening, you have the building of the railroads, you have accumulation of a concentration of credit in the East for the most part, in New York City, and you have in other cities, and you have the control of the railroads and the movement of goods is outside of the hands of the people who are actually farming. And so the farmers come together and they form various organizations. Some are cooperatives that still exist today, and the so-called grangers, the National Grange of the Patrons of Husbandry, formed in 1867, again, 2 years after slavery is abolished. And what they're looking for are laws that will prevent the railroads from basically, I don't want to get too economic, but from charging them or overcharging them for the transportation of their goods. So what they call is discrimination of rates. So if there's a particular rate to go through Illinois and Iowa and Nebraska, that rate should be consistent, right? And that one should not be disadvantaged because of where you live in the plains, and there should not be these what they call discrimination of rates. Because what would happen is there were certain legs where the rates would be higher. And what the farmers were saying is that they were not getting any return on their goods. And so this is a time of what historians call farmers' discontent. And people are saying, let's form alliances. We need to come together as farmers. We need to ask for the direct election of our senators. Thank you, farmers, because we never did that before then. It's the party. They're like, no, we need to figure out who our senators are. They argue for that. They also argue for a lot of things that we would see as socialist platforms, a lot of it coming from things that they read about farmers in Europe, but they're thinking about ways to empower the farmers and to have a bulwark against what they see as the concentration of wealth in the East. And so they form these alliances. The question is, are black farmers going to be included? And how will black farmers, particularly in Nebraska, be seen in this new party, or it becomes actually a political party? And so they formed the National Farmers Alliance, and then the Farmers Alliance and Industrial Union. And then there's another alliance that's formed in the South. It's called the Colored Farmers National Alliance and Cooperative Union. But collectively, they're trying to work to get legislation that will benefit agrarian people and farmers. Oh, hopefully this will come up. Well, anyway, I thought it worked before. I will just go ahead and tell you what he talks about. So the question is, how do you get blacks to be involved? And there are people who are not in favor of integrated alliances. They believe that if blacks are going to be part of the alliance, they need to have a sub-chapter. That means they're not part of the main chapter. They can meet separately. The question is whether or not they can send delegates to vote. There's a lot of consternation about this. But we know that black people are involved in this movement, and they also see themselves as invested in the empowerment of farmers. The first demands come out in Ocala, Florida, which is the first 10 demands. I won't go through them. And then they form what's called the People's Party. So this is really the first alternative party outside of the Democrats and the Republicans. And then they have a meeting in Omaha in 1896, and they put out what's known as the Omaha Platform, their set of demands to favor farmers and small people living in rural areas. And blacks are part of this movement. They see populism as more viable than either being a Democrat or a Republican at that time, because at least the populists, despite the segregation, were speaking what they saw as the language of the people. So with that in the background, we have people who are starting to settle these all black communities, but also there are people who are homesteaders outside of DeWitty. I want to just give a brief shout out to two amazing historians who are working at the Center for Great Plains Studies, also third, Dr. Jake Fryfield and Dr. Michael Brotnoff Ekstrom, who both received their PhDs from my department at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and who have been working on documenting black homesteaders in Nebraska. A former student, also Rebecca Wingo, who is now an assistant professor at the University of Cincinnati, also worked on this project with Rick Edwards, who is the director of the center. And what they've been trying to do is go through all of the censuses to determine actually how many black homesteaders were in the state of Nebraska. Of course, the major colony that we are familiar with, if anybody went to Juneteenth last week at the Malone Center outside at Trago Park, you would have seen the DeWitty Colony families, descendants had a booth, and they were willing to talk to people about their experiences. So important families that come out of the DeWitty Colony, the Shores, which many of us are familiar with, and some of their papers are here, or actually I should say down the street at the Nebraska State Historical Society. The Meehan family. This is the family that came from Canada that I alluded to. Hester was a black Canadian, and Charles was Irish. He was white. They had been married in Canada. They were able to come to Nebraska, and they lived despite the anti-miscegenation law that existed because their marriage was recognized through international treaty. The family did not, interestingly, they talk about it, experience racial discrimination or violence as an interracial family, which is why DeWitty seemed promising, right? No one attacked them. No one tried to, assault them in the streets because they were an interracial family with children. Another important family, Charles and Rosetta Speece. Rosetta actually was a Meehan, so she's one of the Meehans. And they were born in that colony. Later on, they moved to Empire, Wyoming, where they set up another colony. So it's an important group of people. Charles and Rosetta Speece, their child Ava Speece Day, her diaries can be read and her letters at the Nebraska State Historical Society. She left a journal about her life, talking about living next door to various people from all over the world who had migrated, mostly from Eastern Europe, who had migrated to Nebraska, immigrated to Nebraska, and her interaction with them. Another person that's important in this colony was Perils Woodson, who was a school teacher in DeWitty. She spent her summers getting educated and coming back to work in DeWitty, and she remained single during her entire time in the colony. And she just said she didn't want to get married, that she devoted herself to the children and educating the children of DeWitty Colony. This is an interesting colony because you have African Americans escaping the South, and you have Afro-Canadians and an Irish Canadian coming to the western part of Nebraska. And that becomes important for settling that colony. And it's interesting, in Michael's work, he talks about the networks. So this was a network of Canadians and Southerners who knew they could come to Nebraska and word would get back to them. Most of the Southern African Americans who came to DeWitty were from North Carolina. And this is very different. If you start looking at the people who are coming to places like Omaha and Lincoln, they're coming from New Orleans, from Louisiana largely, from Arkansas, Mississippi, Tennessee. It's a very different kind. I mean, there are other groups as well, but a very different kind of orientation in this committee, in this community. And so it's important to understand why they came here. Again, to live in an all-black community, except for the husband who was not. Again, the Homestead Act enabled this, and they were able to get that land. Without getting into too many details, the Homestead Act also required you to prove up, as they would call, your land over the course of 5 years, which meant you had to build structures, and you had to dig wells, and you had to create an irrigation system. And then you needed 3 witnesses to attest that you made those improvements. That way you can get more land. And the race relations were so good with the people around DeWitty that oftentimes those witnesses were white citizens who lived around the colony. But there were some white men who tried to contest black men's ownership of land. And Michael writes about this in his article, who claimed that these men were not residing on the land. Some of them were actually serving in the military as Buffalo soldiers, so they were in and off the land. That later comes out. But overall, the whites who lived around the community, according to oral testimonies and also letters, helped the residents of DeWitty build their church. They also had other forms of interracial cooperation. And we see black homesteaders sometimes occasionally working on the white homesteaders to help them provide, prove up their land and provide for their household. So that is one story of kind of promise and peril, but DeWitty was an important colony. Eventually it's disbanded around 1936. I mean, there's still a marker. There's still people who go back there for their family reunions and other types of reunions. So the day when the actual colony was founded. So it's important to think about that as an alternative. But of course, the majority of people moved to the cities. And I'm going to end with talking a little bit about this race riot and then Lincoln. And the reason why I put this first is because I think this is the ultimate peril. Most people did not see this coming, that African Americans who decided to move to Omaha to mainly work in the stockyards, their neighborhood would become a target of white vigilante justice when a man, Will Brown, was accused of raping a 19-year-old white woman, Agnes Loback. What we know is that 300 people, predominantly men, gathered at the school to discuss the alleged rape. By the end of the day, the crowd had increased to about nearly 4,000 at the courthouse. The demonstrators outside of the courthouse, the mob, demanded that the jail hand over Brown to them so that they may dispense justice. When the police refused to do so, the crowd attacked the police, set the courthouse on fire, attempted to hang the mayor, Mayor Edward P. Smith, when he tried to restore order, and he was saved from the near lynching by onlookers. And finally, I don't show the picture, although it's in almost every documentary about 1919. They were able to get Brown out of the jail, and he was shot, lynched, and then his body was riddled with bullets, and he was then his corpse was set on fire after being dragged into the intersection, and then troops had to be called out. You could read the paper. Crowd lynches Negro at Omaha after the long riot. Omaha riots force martial rule. So that's in that period. But what about Black Lincoln? At the same time, Omaha also had a Lincoln branch of the NAACP. As I said, blacks are in Lincoln in the 1870s. We know they're starting to move in small numbers. There was a barber here. We know other families by the turn of the century are set here. The Lincoln branch of the NAACP was founded in 1918. If you look at the list of people who paid dues that were African Americans, a lot of them, with few exceptions, were domestic workers, men or porters, or had some kind of menial labor, but they believed that they needed a branch of the NAACP in Lincoln because of discrimination and other forms of racism that they experienced in the city. So we see the growth of the Black community. I think it's interesting, and I talk about this with my students about the University of Nebraska, that we're a land-grant university, and because of that, unlike the southern land-grant universities that would create southern Black colleges, right? So you have University of Virginia and you have Virginia State. You understand what I'm saying? You have University of Mississippi or Ole Miss, and then you have Tougaloo or something, right? So this does not happen, right? The University of Nebraska opens its door to Black students. We know that Black students are here. The Jackie Gahn Multicultural Center has a portrait of George Flippin, who was one of the first African American students to attend the university. He was a football player. It was important. And then he went on, his father was also a surgeon. He went on to be a doctor. The first Black sorority, I'm a member of this sorority, so I will say that in full disclosure, was the Delta Sigma Theta sorority. Incorporated, which was chartered in 1922 at the University of Nebraska. Problem was they wouldn't let them have meat on campus, so eventually it disbanded. And then, of course, the Clyde Malone Center becomes the heart of the Black community, the Clyde Malone Community Center. And so what you have in Lincoln is people moving in. Some of them are coming, are able to go to the university. They're joining organizations like the NAACP. There are other organizations as well. They are trying to build Black community in this space. And in many ways, this the lynching in 1919 really shook a lot of people, and there were people questioning whether or not they could survive in Nebraska, and people decided to stay. There are multi-generational Black Nebraskans who have been here and continue to live here and have no intention of leaving, or at least if they leave, they still consider this part of their home. So let me conclude. Black mobility in the United States is historically and currently fraught with promises and peril. That some 12,609 blacks, 4.44% or 44%, 4.44% of the population who identify as Black or African American reside in Lincoln today is a testament to the resilience of Black folks to make a way out of no way, to create spaces where Black culture and community can thrive, and to continue to assert their citizenship. Thank you. So I am open. We have 15 minutes for questions and answers. Yes?
I know there is a DeWitt, Nebraska. I know where the location is, but where was the original colony of DeWitty?
DeWitty Colony is in the western part. Oh, so the question is where is DeWitty Colony? And DeWitty Colony is, hopefully this will work so you can see the map. Well, they have a website. It's in the western part of the state, close to Chadron on the, it's way out west.
Okay.
Let me show you because my link is not working. So, it was later called Audacious. It's way out. Yeah. Just in the Sandhills, right? Is that? Yeah. Isn't that the west? Yeah. So that's where it's located. I have not been there because usually when I go west, I don't go that way. But my plan is next summer to go out to DeWitty, just because I think it's just worth. Sometimes you just got to go and commemorate the spaces where your ancestors came. So that's why I'm going. I'm not a Nebraskan, but I still consider them my ancestors. Yes. Yes.
The picture of the photograph of Mr. Brown.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know when that was taken?
I believe, okay, so the question is, when was the picture taken of William Brown? I don't know. I know that picture was supplied, it occurred through a documentary, so I was able to get it from the documentary and also from a historian up in Omaha. But I believe that picture was published in the newspaper at some point.
It was taken during his arrest.
Yes, thank you.
His eyes just look so.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. It was taken during his arrest. Yes.
My question is, you mentioned when the migration started,
Yes.
it was like 600 and the population was 650 and it went to 17,000. What was the seduction from people to come from where they were to Oklahoma?
That was
during that
Kansas.
time?
Yeah. So Kansas, yeah. So the question was, what enticed people to move from Kansas during that time, so that you go from a population of roughly 700 to about 14,000? I can read those numbers to you again. But there's a couple of things. And I think the main thing is that there were organized blacks. One person in particular, Benjamin Singleton, who was also known as Pap Singleton, had met with various individuals, realized that there was homestead land available in Kansas, that they could purchase this land and start a colony. And they started recruiting people. This is where I get Ho for Nebraska, because actually the actual poster said Ho for Kansas, but I decided to put Nebraska in it. And they would recruit people from the South, and they would say, you need $5, you have to put this down, this will get you to X, Y, and Z. You know, you have to get to St. Louis, then you have to do the overland route, and then you get to Kansas City, Missouri, then you cross over to Kansas City, Kansas, and then you go west. And so there was a recruiting effort. People, we know that Singleton went to various black churches, also his representatives in the South, and encouraged people to come out. And it was always about, this is going to be a colony that we're going to run. And Charlotte Hinger just wrote a wonderful book, which I reviewed, about what happened in the latter years when it actually fails. But it's important to understand that promise, right? That people had been subjected to the things we could only imagine, right? People were tired of sharecropping. That was the main thing. Like, I don't want to sharecrop. I don't want to see the ex-slave owner every day. Guess what? I don't want to know you. I'm ready to leave. And that was a reality. And they were able to convince a lot of people to leave. And they came out west and they really didn't know what to expect. Hinger's book is really good in kind of documenting the kind of shock, because the land is not as fertile as some of that land in the South, right? You're thinking, oh, you just plant something, it's grow. No, it's a totally different kind of land. The winters are harsh, right? You don't have the kind of weather that people were accustomed to the South, but it was that promise, that land, that freedom, having a black governor, a black mayor, a black city council, or whatever, depending on where you were in these black towns, that the sheriff was black, you know, that the school teacher was black, that everything would be controlled by black people, and there was a sense of protection and insulation from racism. And that's what really, why Nicodemus was so powerful. And there were other ones, but Nicodemus has been written about probably the most. There's another one called Mon Bayou, etc. Yes?
But they also had to have a way to make, that's why you wonder, then they said they weren't living on their land. Well, go ahead.
Yeah, so the comment was about kind of the limits of black people's ability to kind of stay on the land year round, and what if there's some kind of, as I understand the question, some kind of either natural disaster or something that prevents black people from making the land profitable, that at some point they would have to work for whites. And that did occur. We know that in DeWitty Colony, that people actually went out and worked for some of the white homesteaders to bring money, but also to help them improve their lands, but also to bring money back in at wages, to get money back into their homes. And I think, you know, I guess this would be my rejoinder. It wasn't, so if I was an immigrant from Monrovia, or I'll use where, from, if I was an immigrant coming from the Pfälzer state, the Palatinate in Germany, or I was an immigrant coming from someplace in what's now present-day Czech Republic, yeah, and I knew anything about the United States, it would not be unfeasible for me to think I could just live among white people. It happened and never have to rely on anybody but white people. That happened all the time.
They had problems, their own problems.
Yeah, but I'm saying that I think sometimes we don't want the realm of possibilities in the 19th century, like people could imagine it and they did make it happen. They imagined all black towns and they made it happen, and I think that's what is interesting to me, is that is something that a lot of people didn't think was possible, and that these towns could be successful, even the ones that closed in the 30s and later on. But it was really this idea that why can't we be self-sufficient? Well, who says we can't do this? And the point was to prove that we could do that. And even if you look at, and I talk about urban history as well, like if you look at black communities like Tulsa, Oklahoma, like that was an all black community, that part of black Tulsa, the Negro Wall Street, everything. The person that cut your hair, the one that buried you, the one that made your clothes, the habitat, everybody was black, your minister. And that was not seen as something that was not in the realm of possibility. And it literally took outside forces to come and burn that place down in 1921 to destroy that. So I'm just thinking about the imagination of black people in a time where I don't think I would have had the courage in the 1860s and 70s.
And we like to think that there's a lot of good people, so if you've got good people working for each other, but it just takes one.
It's true. But if there's one thing to take about it, is just think about that's just a kind of resilience that I don't even know if I possess. I would not. I'm from New York. When my mother said, "You're going where?" I said, "I'm going to University of Nebraska." My mother's from Brooklyn. She's like, "Why?" Because you think about it, and I laugh because we don't understand the resilience of black people sometimes. That took a lot, because I wouldn't have come out here. Now I'm here, I've been here 15 years. I get it. Sometimes you gotta you gotta walk out on faith, as they say. Yes, sir.
Where do we stand today?
Yeah, I don't think people are ready. The question is, where do we stand today publicly regarding the issue of reparations? I think people aren't ready. And I think the reason why a lot of people aren't ready, I wouldn't say most black people understand the argument for reparations. Remember, this is an argument that Frederick Douglass made in the 1860s, not in 2019. And Pap Singleton was like, if you're not gonna give us reparations, can we at least get some land? And they're like, okay, go out to Kansas, So this idea that the U.S. owed something to the United States, actually, it's really David Walker's Appeals, one of the first ones in 1822, where he's like, look, we done worked here forever. What are you going to give us, right? So there's this long history of black people saying, you owe us. Martin Luther King Jr. said there's a check that you need to cash, right? Like, you owe us. And I think people are not ready to understand the wealth that was built off of black labor. But then also, this is the sad part, that it wasn't just labor. It was child trafficking. They were selling people's kids. Systematic rape of women, just craziness, brutality that came with this system of slavery that we like to think, if you've seen Gone with the Wind, it's just people singing and picking cotton. And that's not what was going on. So I think until we have those really hard conversations, and I try to have them with my students, they had to read a book by Tavolia Glymph called Out of the House of Bondage that shook them to their core. Because you got to know those stories so you understand you got to understand, I don't know how they did it. I would not have came out here. I'd have stayed right where I was.
Well, it wasn't very good where they were at.
It doesn't matter. It's the unknown. That's what I'm saying. That's why I pay homage to them, right?
Those blacks were raising the white kids, weren't
That's true.
they? Not their own.
But you get what I'm saying. I'm paying homage to them because I would not have done it. So I praise the ancestors who came out here because I wouldn't have done it. I'd have stayed right where I was and let it be, and hopefully something would happen. So you got to understand that. That's the resilience that we just don't know. And on that, I'll just say, Black Nebraska is still here. It's not going nowhere, as I tell my students, and it's growing every day. Thank you.